This alien told me the exact day the apocalypse begins. The story begins with a sentence that refuses to let you look away. It is not a prophecy about fire or missiles. It is not a forecast of falling stars. It is a warning about a slow, surgical erasure, the quiet loss of our capacity to feel for one another. That claim sits heavy in the air as a figure crouches beneath a sodium lamp in an empty hospital parking lot, cigarette burning down between work-worn fingers. The man beneath the lamp is Dr. Donald Rivera. He is 42, with a face shaped by years of overnight shifts and too many hands held in the moments between life and death. He has spent decades keeping others alive while learning to keep himself at a distance. His palms are calloused in the places where he clamps clamps. His laugh has a practiced softness, and his sleep comes in fragile fragments. Tonight, at 3:17 a.m., he is precisely the sort of person who would not expect the universe to rearrange itself around him, until it does. Rain has just stopped. Steam rises from the asphalt. The hospital silhouette hits the horizon like a dark tooth. Donald smokes because the cigarette approximates a pause he otherwise cannot afford. He is thinking in punctures. Chest pain at 2:03. A septic patient stabilized at 1:10. A mother who refused to leave her child's bedside finally collapsing into silence an hour earlier. He feels a numbness that is not only fatigue. It is a carefully trained tilt of the soul. He has learned to be present without being present, competent without being touched. He has measured his emotional reserves the way he measures his bleeding rates, by necessity, not by choice. It is in that brittle space, halfway between exhaustion and the kind of clarity only grief can manufacture, that the air shifts. The street lamp flares and then seems to dim, not for lack of electricity, but for a change in the room's horizon. An observer has stepped into the periphery. The being walks without sound. Its skin seems like a translucent membrane stretched over circuitry and bone. Light moves through it in bands, like a living screen. It does not approach with hands or weapons. It arrives as if to take notes. Donald does not reach for a stethoscope. He does not think to call security. He is too tired to arm himself against the surreal. Instead, he watches, and the watching is mutual. There is no spoken greeting. There is a soundless insertion of information into his head. Precise, clinical, utterly alien. Observation complete, the thought voice says, clear and clipped. Empathy metrics declining. The timbre is unlike anything on Earth, neither male nor cruel. It feels like a laboratory reading rendered into language. For a moment, Donald assumes he is hallucinating. Sleep deprivation will convince you of many things. But the detail of the voice, the calmness of the intelligence, cuts through skepticism like a scalpel. Then the images start. They are not images the way we think of them, not frames on a screen. They arrive as whole-body sensations. He experiences the first campfire, and simultaneously he understands why it mattered. Heat, story, the pressure of faces lit by a single flame. He feels the smallness of a child's hand in a parent's palm, and the roughness of a man who has crafted a spear and learned to be generous with it. These are not romanticized histories. They are calibrations. The alien's vision indexes the human ability to respond to others, not for survival only, but for cohesion, for meaning. It shows the long arc. The species whose survival once depended on mutual care invents ways to anesthetize itself. Screens appear like distant islands of light. Training manuals valorize necessary distance. Trauma piles up, unprocessed, like debris on a shoreline unseen. Productivity praises efficiency. Efficiency reduces time for tenderness. Religion, when bent toward fearing the end, looks outward rather than inward. Each of these is a small cut. Together, they become a medical chart of erosion. You are within the window, the alien's thought voice intones. Functional, but attenuated. Subjective compassion index, 20% capacity remaining. Donald hears the words, but cannot parse them into disbelief or acceptance immediately. His mind reaches for numbers the way it always has, because numbers are the only thing that have ever sounded like a safe harbor to him. Then the alien clarifies, with the clinical calm that seems to be the creature's native mode. Personal attenuation, 80% deadness of affective responsiveness. There is a ridiculousness to the phrase when translated into the human registry of pain. Deadness, 80%. It lands in him like a diagnosis he has been preoccupied with for years but never named. The alien does not pronounce condescension. It offers a timeline instead. Personal reversal window, 3 to 5 years. Collective threshold, 60 to 65%. Time to projected critical mass, 15 years. Donald thinks of his daughter, Sarah, 12, given to messy hair and clearer questions than most adults can tolerate. He thinks of the half-told apologies to his ex-wife. He watches the cigarette ember glow and die. The numbers become a map of responsibility and terror. The alien's voice is not prophetic in a sermonizing way. It is an observed projection, a model based on trend inputs, magnified by the alien's wider vantage. And then the alien does something Donald did not expect. It names a date. The sentence arrives as an almost clinical insertion. The exact day is April 12, 2040, the alien informs him. 15 years from this projection point, given current vectors. The way that sentence lands leaves no room for melodrama. It is not an apocalyptic scream, but a calendar notation stamped in his mind. Donald can feel his chest tighten. He imagines a calendar he used to mark vacation days, now recalibrated toward an abstract tipping point. The alien's words come with a caveat built into their cadence. This is a projection, an outcome if current trends continue. The being never claims omniscience. It offers the date as a warning modeled against present conditions. Donald speaks, though at first he does not intend to. So, he begins aloud, a human trying to shape himself into inquiry. So, what does that mean for me? Reversibility decreases with time and isolation, the alien replies. 3 to 5 years for individual remediation before pathways become habitualized and less plastically available. Collective cascade becomes probable when 60 to 65% of population exhibits affective attrition. Donald thinks of his rounds, faces he has learned to meet with clinical detachment. He thinks of the young resident who no longer cries for lost patients, only logs them. He thinks of the mother who asked him to promise that someone would look after her child, and the way he had given the promise and then stepped out to scrub his hands of the feeling. The alien's diagnosis reads like an autopsy report written in the present tense. The visions continue. Factory floors where workers function in unseeing rows. Classrooms where children recite facts without practicing kindness. A wedding where the vows are performed and the couples do not touch. Art museums filled with visitors who photograph rather than engage. The future the alien sketches is precise in its banality. The machinery of civilization continues. Bureaucracy hums. Trade persists. It is not collapse in the classical cinematic sense. It is a society that runs on schedule, certified and efficient, but hollowed where tenderness once flowed. You will watch systems continue to function, the thought voice says. You will not watch meaning multiply. Donald experiences the scenes and then pulls back, like someone recalling a fever dream. He wants to be outraged. He wants to be incredulous. Instead, he feels the slow press of a different kind of alarm, one that asks for practical antidotes. The alien does not flinch from offering them. It outlines the shape of a solution without turning into a preacher. It speaks of small daily choices, practices that could reverse the trend if adopted widely. Scheduled disconnection, intentional presence, ritualized processing, community weaving. The alien's language is clinical, but its proposed remedies are human scale. Before Donald can fully integrate the enormity of what he has been told, the moment stretches and contracts. The alien's perception of time is not human. When it retracts its attention, 30 minutes have passed in the hospital lot. Donald looks around, aware he has been standing there with the cigarette gone to ash. He checks his watch. The night nurse's light flicks in a distant window. The ordinary world resumes its rhythm, but something inside him has shifted and will not quite settle back into the grooves that once kept him moving. He goes back inside. The sterile corridors smell of disinfectant and coffee. He washes his hands more deliberately than usual. A man in his mid-60s asks for assurance, and Donald offers it with his professional warmth. But the alien's language is now echoing in his head. Numbers, windows, thresholds. He tries to resume his cognitive routine, triage, diagnosis, stabilization. The work goes on, as it always did. He does his job well. But the alien's presence has left a residue, a question about what his competence is worth if his capacity to care is slipping. He thinks about the causes the alien showed him with the precise economy of a clinician turning a lamp to different parts of a body. Each cause was not an accusation, more like an anatomical chart. First, technology. The alien did not condemn devices. It illustrated how a device, designed to connect, also retrains the brain to glance rather than linger. It showed a montage of faces lit by screens, faces that now mirrored the light back without registering the person in front of them. Donald remembered a father scrolling through messages during his son's recital. He remembered looking down at screens after long resuscitations, using contact with light to replace the unmade space where reflection should have lived. The alien's image was simple. Repeated micro-distracted interactions create a scaffolding for disengagement. Second, professional training. The alien showed surgical suites, classrooms, and a steady stream of clinicians being taught to protect themselves by ritualized detachment. Detachment as survival strategy, the thought voice observed. Protection becomes habit. Habit becomes default. Donald recognized his own education in that scene, the quiet applause for physicians who compartmentalize grief, the admiration for those who carry loss without breaking. He had been trained to be steady. He had been trained to minimize suffering's emotional toll. In a system that rewards such steadiness, the soul can atrophy. Third, collective trauma. The alien showed a stacked timeline: pandemics, wars, social ruptures. It did not need to explain that trauma begets numbing. Donald knew it as a clinician who had treated both the immediate wounds and the aftershocks. Unprocessed trauma consolidates into a cultural scaffolding that favors numbness, the alien projected. It gave no clinical certainty, only a pattern. Societies that do not process sorrow institutionalize habits of emotional compression. Fourth, productivity culture. The vision showed calendars overflowing with tasks, email chains, and a culture that rewards outputs over presence. People measure worth by deliverables rather than by daily acts of care. The alien's assessment was blunt. Efficiency without integration erodes time for relational repair. Fifth, a fear-driven religious posture. The alien's depiction was careful, almost anthropological. It did not attack faith, but illustrated a posture. When religious focus becomes a fixed looking outward for apocalyptic signs, it displaces inward repair. People wait for heaven to intervene rather than engaging in the messy work of healing. Donald thought of sermons that fed anxiety about external ruins while neglecting the slow collapse that happens under our own rooftops. As the alien mapped these causes, Donald watched them stack into a pattern he had been unconsciously learning to live inside. He saw how his life had become reactive, checking boxes, triaging feelings, putting off conversation until the next day. He could map the ways he had avoided his daughter's questions about her mother, the way he had postponed grief under a calendar of "I will when I have time." He recognized the scaffolding of avoidance because he had helped erect it in himself and others. The alien did not leave him with condemnation. It offered a kind of counsel, a list of small daily choices that might be taken as prophylaxis. Micro-practices, the thought offered, can recalibrate communal thresholds. The language was again clinical, then human. It asked him to imagine altering his day with incremental interventions that would, if repeated across many lives, change system dynamics. Donald is a man of routines. That is what makes him effective in the emergency room. He now faces the possibility of repurposing routine toward a different end. Not simply surviving the night, but tending to the human currency that makes life more than maintenance. Outside, on the asphalt, dawn is still hours away. Inside, alarm bells ring, monitors flash, work continues. Donald goes back to the nurse's station, and in between orders and charting, he tries one of the alien's suggestions simply to see what happens. He takes 10 seconds. 10 seconds held with intention between finishing a set of orders and hitting the next task. In those 10 seconds, he breathes deliberately, feels the weight of his hands, registers the presence of a young tech who is carrying a box of supplies and whose eyes meet his in a tired, honest way. He does not offer the box words, but he allows the contact to exist. It is small. It is nearly meaningless by many measures. It does not fix the world, but it is a tiny reversal of a habitual pattern. It is a refusal to move on autopilot. The alien's counsel rings in his head like a list of practical experiments. Pause and feel. Scheduled face-to-face time without devices. Processing trauma through writing and sharing. Weekly technology fast. Daily intentional vulnerability. Humanizing the people you serve. Joining a community of reversers. The words are simple, and in their simplicity they feel possible. They are not cures, they are not promises. They are invitations. After his shift, Donald goes home to a kitchen that smells faintly of old coffee. Sarah is awake, reading under the lamp with socks kicked off. She looks up when he enters, and for a moment he is tempted to keep to the perimeter of their shared space. Conversation as a checklist. He thinks of the alien's numbers, the date, the phrase 15 years, and something like a new courage takes shape in him. He sits beside her and closes his phone. It is a small ritual, no announcement, no dramatics, just presence. She lifts her head, surprised at first, then settles back into the book. But from that evening onward, something between them shifts. He does not declare a resolution. He simply begins to show up in small, consistent ways. A 10-second centering before bed, a question that is not procedural but curious, an evening when he asks about her day and then listens without composing an answer. In the days that follow, Donald tries another of the alien's micro-practices. He sets a single afternoon that week as a techless hour. He announces it to his team as an experiment, curious, not preachy, and he watches what happens. The first minutes are awkward. The absence of a screen feels like a newly discovered limb. But within that hour, two colleagues who rarely speak with each other end up talking about a patient they had both failed to reach, and they share sloppy, human confessions that would have otherwise sit lodged in their chests. The hour does not make the world whole, but it loosens a knot. These are the small wins that the alien suggested could aggregate into systemic change if adopted widely. The being had made a specific modeling claim. If about 15% of the population adopt reversal practices and demonstrate them consistently, that could alter the dynamics enough to prevent a cascade to the 60% tipping point. It offered no certainty, only a conditional hope. Change in local rhythms could create different global outcomes. He begins to think like a clinician again, but in a different register. Instead of triaging the body, he begins to triage the relational field. Identify areas of hardening, prescribe short daily interventions, monitor outcomes. He calls the alien's prescribed set of 7 practices a toolkit rather than a doctrine. Each practice is meant to be small, repeatable, measurable in human terms. They are not therapeutic commandments. They are behavioral experiments that could recalibrate the systems he now sees more clearly. At the hospital, the resident who had refrained from tears after a recent loss turns toward Donald one evening and asks quietly, "How do you not break?" Donald has no formula. He finds his own voice, rough around the edges, sounding almost like the alien's clinical cadence, but softened by human experience. "You make tiny concessions to your heart," he says. "You give it moments to remember how to move." He tells the resident about the 10-second pause. He recommends the hour with no devices. He does not make promises. He shares, instead, the anecdotal effect those minutes have had on him. The first unexpected urge to cry when Sarah asked a blunt question, the way the resident's face softened when allowed to speak about the patient fully, the odd, small taste of relief that followed a confession. Word moves like a contagion different from infection. It looks like people imitating habits. Teams in the ER who start with a 2-minute intention at the beginning of a shift, a clinic that schedules 1 hour a week where phones go in a bin, a faith community that spends time on confession and inward repair rather than only forecasting apocalypse. These are modest changes. They do not register on GDP charts. They do not enter into nightly news cycles, but they create pockets of practice where a different habit can root. And yet, the alien's numbers remain a drumbeat under Donald's new experiments. The date, the specific phrase, April 12, 2040, hovers with the weight of a calendar that might one day be pronounced in the same breath as funerals. He cannot know whether the projection is accurate, sensible, or merely a story crafted by an intelligence unfamiliar with the inner life of human hope. He knows only that the admission of a date moves his moral imagination in ways vague forecasts did not. It makes a frame for urgency. The alien had said, April 12, 2040, 15 years from now, is the projected tipping point if trends continue. The being then added, in a way that felt like a laboratory footnote rather than an edict, model sensitivity to reversal practices shows potential for significant deviation. 15% adoption of reversal practices reduces cascade probability in modeled scenarios. Donald keeps hearing that last clause, the 15% model parameter, like a line of code he might debug. It suggests that mass behavior can be nudged by local practices and by example, not by mass panic or by coercion. It suggests that the apocalypse the alien spoke about is not only avoidable, but must be addressed through repeated, humble acts rather than through grand gestures. By the time he finishes a second 2-hour shift, he is exhausted in a way that does not feel like surrender. There is a movement inside him towards something like focus. He has tasted what intentional presence feels like. He has seen how it creates room for speech and for tenderness. The alien, in its odd, detached way, had offered a prescription for behavioral experiments. The moral and strategic question now seems to him less cosmic and more domestic. Will he make those practices routine enough to see measurable change in his own life? And will he accept the responsibility of inviting others to try them too? There is an awkwardness to offering these practices to colleagues. Suggesting vulnerability to people who have learned to mask their feelings for survival can feel like proffering a cure with unknown side effects. But Donald tries anyway. He frames the suggestions as experiments. "Let's take 10 seconds, he says once, in the middle of a chaotic resuscitation debrief. It is small. It is not theatrical. Someone laughs, a sound like a relieved exhale. And then everyone takes the 10 seconds. They breathe. Someone confesses a slip-up. Another thanks them for noticing. A resident cries quietly into his hands, then composes himself. The eroding effect of denial becomes less binding when people are permitted, in small increments, to let feeling move. This is the ground-level work the alien had indicated could make the difference between a future of hollow functioning and one of recuperated compassion. The alien had not claimed that 10 seconds would rewire the world. It had not offered miracles. It had proposed repeated micro-practices as plausible levers in complex social systems. Donald, both trained in medicine and newly acquainted with that extraterrestrial forecast, begins to move through his days with this paradox at the center. The smallest contradicts the largest. A 10-second choice, multiplied, could change history. If you want the practical steps in a downloadable guide, hit subscribe and check the pinned comment for the ebook. The first week of practice produces small wins that do not solve anything but alter habit. He sleeps less defensively. He stops checking his phone in the morning for 10 minutes and instead makes a ritual of standing at the window with Sarah while breakfast cooks. She begins to ask questions that a father can now actually answer. He writes for 10 minutes each night, free, messy notes about the day, and he shares one of them with a colleague in the break room, a confession about a moment he had kept private. The colleague listens, then shares her own fragment of hardness. That shared vulnerability does not erase their suffering, but it changes the weight of it. 3 weeks into these small experiments, the alien's warning returns with a sharper edge. Donald dreams of a city where people move in rows, heads down, their gestures efficient but disconnected. In the dream, babies are attended to on schedule, not with warmth. It is a future that terrifies him not because of its cinematic horror, but because it is plausible and ordinary. He wakes with his heart pounding and goes downstairs to his daughter's room to check she is breathing. She is. She is alive and messy and real. The alien's voice had told him once, "You will watch systems continue to function. You will not watch meaning multiply." So Donald decides to test whether meaning can be coaxed to multiply by ordinary means. He schedules a weekly hour to be fully present with Sarah. No screens, no task lists. They play board games badly. They fail to keep score. They invent a ridiculous handshake. Each hour becomes a small deposit in a bank of relational currency that, he now understands, compounds in quiet ways. As the days fold into months, the alien's projection keeps its place on the edge of his awareness, like an invitation to urgency, not hysteria. It is a reminder that numbers matter, and that timing matters too. He does not move to panic. He moves to practice. He accepts that he cannot fix everything. He does accept that he can practice differently. He chooses to teach his colleagues how to make those 10-second pauses, to advocate for a weekly clinic hour with no devices, to set an example in his community faith group by asking them to turn inward for repair before looking outward for signs of doom. And yet, beneath the newly built habits, there remains the question the alien had left mid-sentence. What happens when a mind is 80% attenuated? What does reversal look like at that stage? The alien has given him a window, 3 to 5 years, for personal reversal before certain neural pathways settle into habits that will be harder to change. That time frame is both a grace and a warning. It is a chance, not a guarantee. As the first part of his year of experimenting concludes, Donald sits alone in his car one night, fingers wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. He thinks of the spring date the alien named, April 12, 2040. It is a notch on the calendar that represents a possible future, one malleable if enough people change their daily rhythms. He does not know how to carry that date to his patients without sounding sensational. He only knows how to carry it in the way he lives, small acts, repeated, modeled, taught. Inside the hospital that night, a young nurse, who had watched Donald begin to change, finds him in the break room and says simply, "I cried today. I didn't think I could. It was like the room opened." He has no grand answer to give her. He offers instead a practical suggestion he has learned to trust. Keep making room for it. 10 seconds. An hour. Tell someone. It is a prescription that does not promise a cure. It is a strategy. The alien had told him that the precise day, April 12, 2040, was a marker based on current trends. It had offered a model where 15 years out, the world might tip toward a kind of mass affective attrition. But it also insisted that the model is sensitive to human choice. That insistence is the hinge of Donald's action. He cannot erase the future with will alone. He can, however, change the shape of his daily life and invite others to do the same. By the time the weeks accrue into months, small communities of practice begin to form around him. A group of clinicians who take 10 seconds. A modest support circle that writes together. A parent who meets once a week with other parents to talk about presence rather than performance. None of these measures is a grand solution. They are, in aggregate, the type of slow work that recalibrates social systems. But there are moments that resist slow repair. There are cases where the damage is sharper. Donald meets a patient whose affect is markedly blunted, months of unprocessed grief folded into resignation. The alien's image of an 80% deadness is no longer an abstract number. It is visible in black circles under the patient's eyes, in the hollowness of the smile. Donald cannot pretend that 10-second pauses will untangle every knot. He can only be honest about the limits of practice and the need for professional help when necessary. He refers the patient to supportive services, frames the situation with compassion, and continues his own micro-practices as a model. At times, the alien's clinical detachment seems almost merciful in how it refuses to dramatize. At other times, it is maddening for its lack of human warmth. Donald finds himself oscillating between taking its warnings as urgent instruction and resenting its coldness. He is human, after all. He wants a story with closure. The alien offers only conditional models and a date stamped into a 15-year horizon. As the first arc of this story draws to a transitional point, Donald stands at a threshold. He has experimented, he has taught, he has failed and tried again. The alien's projection, April 12, 2040, sits in his memory like a calendar scribble in a margin. The world continues to function. People continue to make appointments, write reports, and buy groceries. And yet, beneath the ordinary motions, a new question is rippling through pockets of people like him. What becomes of civilization if the machinery of society functions without the warmth that gives life meaning? Donald does not pretend to have an answer. He only knows 3 things with a growing clarity. 1. The alien gave him a date and a model framed by 15 years. 2. He carries an 80% deadness that is both diagnosis and invitation. 3. The small daily practices he has begun to keep are changing the texture of his life in ways that feel real. The rest of the work, public, communal, and systemic, remains to be seen. Tonight, beneath a different hospital lamp, he writes in a small notebook that has become one of his new rituals. He writes briefly, April 12, 2040 is on the calendar. I have less than 5 years. I will try to teach 10 seconds. He closes the notebook and slides it into the pocket of his coat. Outside, the city hums the same. Inside, something deliberate has been set in motion. The alien had offered a date as a moment of clarity. What Donald must decide next is how many others he can invite into the daily practice that might make that date less final than it sounds. The next step is not yet clear, but the choice to take small actions has been made. He closes the notebook and slips it into his coat as if tucking a small, fragile truth into a pocket. The pocket keeps the ink warm. The city keeps its low hum. For a week, his actions remain quiet, deliberate, experimental, not yet public. He knows how fragile momentum can be. One odd attempt, one misphrased suggestion, and a room full of exhausted professionals will fold back into the habits that save them from feeling at the cost of feeling. He also knows that habits are habits because they are teachable, repeatable patterns. If he can make these new patterns legible, replicable, and small enough to survive fatigue, they might outlast his own stamina. So he builds a scaffolding, a list he can teach. He calls it the 7 practices, simple anchors for presence that, taken together, form a protocol anyone can try. He will not call it therapy. He will not frame it as a cure. He will present it as a set of behavioral experiments. easily measurable and snug enough to fit into a shift, a commute, a kitchen table. 1. Pause and feel. The alien had offered a 10-second micropause as if it were medicine. Donald formalizes it. He writes the instruction down in the notebook he carries everywhere. After delivering news, after finishing a procedure, before you pick up the next chart, hold for 10 full seconds. Breathe. Attend to the sensation of your hands, the warmth of the air, the pulse in your throat. In the first week, he models it openly. He tells a junior nurse, "Try 10 now," and then tells no one else. The 10 seconds become a small permission to inhabit the moment you just survived. For viewers, try it after your next call or meeting, 10 seconds of real breathing. 2. Scheduled face-to-face without devices. Donald starts a weekly room at the hospital. 1 hour, phones in a box, lights softer, chairs arranged to face one another. He calls it a test. The first meeting is awkward. People hover, glance at the box, then slowly sit. No one checks a message. Someone brings coffee. Someone confesses to being afraid of feeling overwhelmed. The confession lands not as weakness, but as currency. The hour does not magically heal them, but it gives them a place to practice being seen. For viewers, pick 1 weekly hour where you silence notifications and meet someone without screens. 3. Process trauma through writing and sharing. Donald returns to the notebook practice and expands it. He asks colleagues to write for 10 minutes at the end of a shift, a raw, unedited jot about what hit them that day. He starts a small circle where one person reads aloud what they wrote, not as performance, but as offering. The act of reading rewires experience from isolated load into shared narrative. It does not replace therapy. It creates accountability to the body and to others. For viewers, write for 10 minutes tonight, then share 1 paragraph with a friend or a trusted colleague. 4. Weekly technology fast. He borrows the language of Sabbath but keeps it secular and small. 1 full day, or for starters, 1 5-hour block where devices are put away. When Donald tries it, he discovers emptiness, and then, after an awkward first hour, the sound of a neighbor raking leaves, the sight of a child tying shoelaces, a morning sun that seems to have more color without a backlit blue screen. At work, he advocates for clinic-wide pilot days when administrative messages go into a timeout. The results are messy, missed updates, human conversation, but the mess has a different quality. For viewers, experiment with a technology pause this weekend. Start with 3 hours and notice what shows up. 5. Daily intentional vulnerability. Vulnerability, Donald has found, is not a theatrical confession. It is a repeatable practice of saying one true thing about how you are. He models this with Sarah too. Not grand apologies, but small admissions. "I was scared today," followed by a short listening space. He asks colleagues to say one true thing at handoff, one non-clinical sentence that maims a feeling and nothing else. The effect is subtle but accumulative. People stop pretending to be empty heroes and begin to present as people with limits. For viewers, tonight, say 1 honest sentence to someone you trust. 6. Humanizing the people you serve. The alien's visions of sterile wards and mechanical kindness pressed on Donald the importance of the stories people carry. He begins to collect small biographical facts, what a patient likes for breakfast, what music calms them, rather than treating notes as only clinical markers. When he shares a patient's story with the team, the atmosphere shifts. Procedures are still performed well, but with a renewed orientation toward the person behind the chart. For viewers, tomorrow, ask the person serving you one question that has nothing to do with their job. 7. Joining a community of reversers. The last practice is not solitary. Donald understands that individual recalibration can be eaten by system pressures. He helps found a loose network, clinicians, parents, faith leaders, teachers, who meet monthly to exchange what works and what fails. They call themselves, privately, a reverser circle. Publicly, they call themselves a support group. The alien had said that if 15% of the population take up reversal practices, the modeled cascade probability drops significantly. The number, for Donald, functions both as a call and as a sanity check. It is large enough to matter and small enough to imagine. Each practice he teaches, along with tiny procedural instructions: how to cue the 10 seconds, a breath, a hand on the sternum, how to create a phone box and respect it, how to write quickly and eccentrically, how to invite vulnerability without pressuring. He emphasizes the experimental quality: measure, iterate, share results. No guarantees, he tells anyone who asks, just experiments and repeated attention. As he rolls these practices out, resistance appears. A department head calls it naive. A physician scoffs, asking, "Is this emotional indulgence when people are dying?" Donald answers with clinical humility. His job remains the same. He learns to frame the practices as functional: steadiness, not softness; resilience, not suppression. He says, more often, we can carry competence and tenderness at the same time. He finds language that makes the practices defensible within a system that values efficiency: micropauses that reduce error, scheduled face-to-face replacing hurried, misread handoffs, a community that reduces burnout by distributing emotional labor. Some of the early adopters are surprising: surgeons who quietly begin the 10 seconds before cases, a paramedic who refuses to scroll through messages while on a cigarette outside a hospital entrance and instead stands present with the sky. Word moves, slow and patchy, like a virus in reverse, a contagion of attention. The hospital's director notices marginal improvements in staff retention in one pilot unit and asks Donald to present the data. He offers small numbers: fewer unscheduled callouts, modestly lower turnover in the pilot month. He emphasizes the caveats and invites further study. The director, trained in numbers, is oddly moved by a slide that contains a single patient testimony. "He asked my name," a woman in palliative care had said, "and then he held my hand like he remembered it was a thing you do." Little things, measured. Not everyone benefits. Donald meets a patient one afternoon who was farther along the alien scale of attenuation: eyes dull, gestures efficient, affect blunted. There is a hollowness that no 10-second pause seems capable of reaching in one visit. He refers this patient for supportive services and speaks openly about limits. Practices are adjuncts, not substitutes. He does not allow narrativizing the alien into a miracle worker. He continues to offer the practices as accessible tools, not as replacements for medical care. That honesty, paradoxically, makes it easier for people to trust him. 3 months in, a modest cultural shift has taken hold. Pockets of people who behave differently and who, in doing so, make a microenvironment where feeling can be practiced. The tangible changes are small but real. A resident who once dismissed grief begins to cry at a memorial and then to sit with the family after. An ER nurse who had been avoiding her own father's funeral time off takes leave and returns with a different gait. The practices, repeated enough, start to create a new grammar for attending. Then, in an otherwise ordinary twilight, the alien returns. It is not the same theatrical encounter. There is less spectacle and more clinical observation. The being appears at the edge of a rooftop garden that Donald has begun to visit at shift change. He has taken to standing there with his notebook, watching the city breathe. Tonight, the air is cooler. The alien's presence is a stillness that rearranges ambient noise into a kind of data point wind. It inserts information this time with a different cadence, less directive, more modeling. "You have modeled variation," the thought voice says. "Intervention uptake measurable, local deviations emerging." Donald, who by now has practiced the art of saying one true thing aloud, answers with a question instead of a petition. "Show me," he asks. "Show me the world that happens if more of us do this." The alien responds in images and calibrated probabilities. The first sequence is the world as it might be if the trends continue unchecked. The camera of its mind lingers on an ordinary morning in 2040, April 12, so much the date now that writing it produces a small ache in him. The city moves on schedule. Commuters leave apartments on programmable reminders. Schools teach facts. Children graduate competent but spatially distant from empathy-based curricula. Art galleries are full of photographs but empty of conversation. Hospitals are efficient. Procedures on time, beds turned over. But the faces of staff have the distant sheen of practice detachment. The alien's narrative in this branch is clinical and precise. Systems function, relational density declines, art and ritual atrophy. The human cost is not dramatic collapse, but a persistent erosion of meaning. The alien's line is concise, function without flourish. Then the vision shifts to the alternate branch, a world where pockets of reverse practice have expanded into neighborhoods, workplaces, and schools. Children are taught attentional practices early, 10-second pauses turned into a playful breath game in first grade. Teachers slot a daily hour for presence, where students tell one true thing about their day. Workplaces experiment with phone-free lunchrooms and micro-pauses between meetings. Adults model attending with messy humility. Hospitals keep 1 hour where staff are encouraged to write and to meet without devices. The practice reduces error and improves communication. In this branch, April 12, 2040 is not a single day of apocalypse, but a day that marks a tipping point averted, an anniversary celebrated by those who remember what hollow functioning looked like and who commit themselves to continuing practice. The alien's assessment is quieter here. Diversity of practice increases resilience, cascade probability reduced. Donald watches both futures with a clinician's appetite for pattern recognition and a father's appetite for possibility. His chest tightens when he sees the sterile version, because the banality of it is a cruelty. He finds tears in the alternative future, not because everything is perfect, but because tenderness is visible again in quotidian gestures. The way a barista remembers a customer's mother's name, the way a child touches another child's sleeve to help steady them on the playground, the way an older man in a waiting room hums a tune and another joins in. The alien punctuates the images with a statistic he had given earlier. 60 to 65% as the collective threshold toward which the world might drift, and 15% as the modeled share whose adoption of reversal practices could significantly alter cascade probability. Probability is an expression of current vectors, it notes. Behavioral shifts at scale alter networked outcomes. Donald hears numbers differently now. They are not abstractions. They are scaffolds for moral imagination. If 15% seems like a small fraction of humanity, it is also a figure that can be reached by replicable, low-friction practices. It asks that people adopt a set of habits not as one-time commitments, but as repeatable rhythms. The alien adds, for the final human-facing touch, model is sensitive to replication and maintenance. Seeding and reinforcement are required. When the vision recedes, Donald remains on the rooftop, with the alien's images humming in his head like an index. He thinks of Sarah, of the ex-wife he has not fully reconciled with, of colleagues who will either adopt or scoff. The path forward is ordinary work, modeling, teaching, advocating, and quietly gathering others into practice. He decides, in that precise human way of deciding, to scale what he has started without turning it into a crusade. He begins with modest interventions that fit within his responsibilities. He writes a simple, 2-page handout describing the 7 practices and how to pilot them in a unit. He asks his director for permission to run a 3-month pilot in a busy ward, promising to collect outcomes related to staff well-being and handoff errors. Permission is granted under conditions. He will not compromise care, he will involve the clinical governance team, and he will present monthly updates. These constraints, which might feel bureaucratic to some, make the work more durable. The pilot starts with skepticism, the classic barrier to any innovation. In the first week, a nurse complains that she feels like she's being asked to add emotional labor to an already overflowing plate. Donald listens, admitting the extra ask without diminishing the burden. He offers options.
Make the 10 seconds truly 10 seconds. Choose the hour without devices in low activity windows. Write for 5 minutes instead of 10. He frames the pilot as a series of micro-adjustments. The nurse, given permission to adapt, tries a scaled-down version. A week later, she tells him, with surprise, that she laughed with a colleague during a phone-free lunch, and it felt strange in a good way. Small changes beget different questions. A hospital administrator asks if the practices might be exported beyond clinicians, into administrative teams, into the outpatient clinic, into the cafeteria. Donald says yes and offers the playbook. He also insists on data collection, self-reported measures of perceived empathy, measured burnout scales, and qualitative narratives. These constraints, which might feel bureaucratic to some, make the work more durable. The pilot starts with skepticism, the classic barrier to any innovation. In the first week, a nurse complains that she feels like she's being asked to add emotional labor to an already overflowing plate. Donald listens, admitting the extra ask without diminishing the burden. He offers options. Make the 10 seconds truly 10 seconds. Choose the hour without devices in low activity windows. Write for 5 minutes instead of 10. He frames the pilot as a series of micro-adjustments. The nurse, given permission to adapt, tries a scaled-down version. A week later, she tells him, with surprise, that she laughed with a colleague during a phone-free lunch, and it felt strange in a good way. Small changes beget different questions. A hospital administrator asks if the practices might be exported beyond clinicians, into administrative teams, into the outpatient clinic, into the cafeteria. Donald says yes and offers the playbook. He also insists on data collection, self-reported measures of perceived empathy, measured burnout scales, and qualitative narratives.
The project begins to produce the mixed evidence he expects: small quantitative improvements, richer qualitative testimony. The mixedness of the evidence is useful because it keeps the tone honest. By the end of the first quarter, the pilot has some visible outcomes: fewer unplanned sick bays in the pilot unit, informal reports of easier handoffs, and a growing list of staff members who volunteer to teach the 10-second pause during orientation. The reverser circle, already a modestly connected group beyond the hospital, grows threefold as word travels through a parent-teacher network and a local church's small group. The idea migrates slowly into community spaces. A teacher starts a morning breathing practice in class. A barista initiates a phone-free table. These adoptions, distributed and unpredictable, are precisely what the aliens model indicated as possible levers for systemic change. Yet, not every attempt succeeds. A tech company that promised to pilot a week of device fasting cancels under pressure from distant shareholders. A faith leader misreads the practices as moralizing and pulls away. These failures are as instructive as the wins. They reveal where structural incentives work against tenderness and where the work must be reconfigured. Donald continues to attend to his domestic life with the renewed attentiveness the practices foster. He writes every night, sometimes fragmented, sometimes raw. Once, he leaves a note in the kitchen where Sarah will find it, a small apology that is not performative. "I am sorry I was absent when you needed me," followed by a question: "What did you see today?" She answers with shrug and a scribbled drawing of a dog. It is small. It is everything. They do not leap to a theatrical reconciliation. Rather, the inches they gain are cumulative. He also tries to reach his ex-wife. He writes a short, honest email without rhetorical flourishes. Not a demand for forgiveness, but an admission of failings and an offer of shared parenting practices that prioritize presence for their daughter. She reads the note and replies with caution. They arrange to meet in a neutral coffee shop. The meeting is awkward and honest. Neither drama nor false cheer, but an exchange of boundaries and a small agreement to coordinate on Sarah's weekly practice hour. Neither promises forever. Both promise attempts. As the pilot continues, the reverser network convenes a public workshop. Donald is asked to speak, though speak feels like too grand a word for the way he shares what he has learned. He tells a crowd of mixed professionals and neighbors, teachers, clergy, nurses, a few curious journalists, about small experiments and unpredictable kindness. He shares anonymized stories, a resident who found her tears, a patient who had their name remembered. He offers the audience the 7 practices and 1 behavioral instruction to try that evening: 10 seconds with someone you care about. After the talk, a woman in the front row approaches him. She is a school principal who wants to pilot the 10-second pause in her school. She says, "We have kids who stop laughing too early. Can I try this?" Donald feels the calibrating weight of possibility again. A small practice entering a place where it can shape development. He gives her the playbook and a caution about fidelity. Teach it playfully, make it routine, and measure it in laughter and disruptions rather than in standardized test scores. The months pass. The pilot yields a mosaic of small improvements and stubborn challenges. The alien's date remains a horizon that structures urgency but does not become a drumbeat of despair. Donald's personal window, 3 to 5 years, remains a private pressure. He knows the reversal is possible and also that he must scale practices now. He decides to write a practical guide, a compact resource that distills the 7 practices into accessible, field-tested steps. The guide will be practical, not preachy. It will include scripts, how to invite a team to take 10 seconds, how to set up a phone box, how to run a 5-minute writing circle. He intends it to be free, portable, and open to adaptation. One night, months into the project, he dreams again of April 12, 2040. But the dream is not an omen. It is a rehearsal of habits. He imagines his daughter in a future where tenderness is a practice taught in schools and workplaces. He imagines being older, still imperfect, still practicing the 10 seconds. The dream has no finality, only a sense that small practices, repeated and reinforced, might be enough. Reality resists sentimental arcs. The hospital faces budget cuts. Administrators ask for metrics that can be shown to stakeholders. Donald refines the data collection, presenting both numbers and narratives. He does not manipulate results. He shows both the messy qualitative notes and the modest quantitative shifts. He argues, gently and persistently, that systems care for data. If they see something that saves costs, fewer sick days, lower turnover, they will fund it. He learns to speak in the language of systems while insisting on the language of care. Public attention comes as a ripple and then a sigh. A local paper runs a piece on the 10 seconds experiment that treats it with affectionate skepticism. The article includes a quote from a nurse who says, "It saved my hands from the habit of moving on." The piece is not a miracle story. It is a quiet human interest column. People share it. A few hospitals ring asking to hear about the pilot. Donald continues to be cautious with the alien's image. He never photographs the encounter, never turns it into spectacle. He uses the alien as a narrative catalyst in private conversations. "I had a wake-up call," but he avoids turning the story into currency. He worries about cult of personality dynamics. The work must not be about him. It must be a set of practices people can adopt without needing a profit. And then, as the second year of practice turns, something small and public happens that lifts the practice beyond the pilot. A community festival organized by the Reverser Circle that centers on presence rather than production. It is simple and strange. No booths for endorsement, no branded giveaways, just tables with crayons, phone-free zones, and intergenerational storytelling hour. Parents bring kids, some skeptics come to observe. A reporter covers the festival with bemused curiosity and then, unexpectedly, writes about a father who stopped checking his messages and instead taught his son to play a simple hand clap game. The story circulates in unexpected channels, online parenting forums, local radio, then in a few national newsletters. The reverser practices migrate again, into PTA meetings, into a corporate HR newsletter, into a church bulletin. As adoption grows beyond the hospital, the alien's modeled sensitivity becomes more than a line on a page. It becomes a built-in reminder that systems can be shaped by repeated small changes. The 15% parameter is still just a model, but models matter for imagination. If 15% of communities and institutions adopt and maintain these practices, the model suggests probability shifts away from cascade. That is not a promise. It is an invitation and a partial calculation made by an intelligence that maps trends. In the third year, the Reverser Network scales its outreach, an online guidebook, workshops, and a modest consulting offer for organizations that want help implementing pilots. Donald helps draft the guide and co-leads workshops, careful to keep the tone practice-oriented rather than therapeutic. He is aware of ethical lines. He does not prescribe therapy, he does not ask people to stop medications, and he advises professional referrals when a person presents with deep trauma. He knows the limit between micro-practices and clinical intervention. Sarah, who is now 15, begins to express an adolescent impatience with her father's experiments. There are evenings when she rolls her eyes and retreats. There are other evenings when she lingers and asks him how his day went. She sees the effort, and sometimes she sees the fatigue. Once, after a long week of shifts, Donald confesses, one true thing, that he is scared he won't be able to feel when it matters. Sarah listens. She does not lecture. She says simply, then make the small ones count. Her bluntness is a kindness. He takes the instruction like a prescription and doubles down on small, repeatable acts. He continues his nightly writing, his 10 seconds at the end of each shift, and his weekly techless hour. The Reverser Circle's growth is uneven, geographic, and cultural. Some communities adapt the practices to local idioms. One church turns the 10 seconds into a shared breath before the hymn. A school embeds writing circles into advisory periods. A hospice integrates the practice of humanizing patients into narrative rounds. These adaptations teach Donald new things about fidelity and flexibility. Practices succeed when they are both recognizable and malleable. Yet the alien's models are not idle. In scattered places where institutional forces remain hostile, workplaces that valorize constant connectivity, and where managers consider devices as productivity tools, the practices make no headway. In other locales, structural constraints, poverty, overcrowding, lack of paid leave mean that people cannot easily adopt weekly technology fasts or serene phone-free lunches. Donald and the Reverser Network begin to grapple with equity. Practices must be adaptable to contexts where time and resources are scarce. They develop microvariants, 3-minute pauses instead of 10, brief writing prompts instead of full 10-minute entries, communal phone-free corners in crowded staff rooms. The ethic that emerges is simple: make the smallest useful version accessible to the busiest. As the years fold on, Donald feels the personal window tighten in the background like a watchful clock. He knows he has 3 to 5 years to materially change his own affective pathways before certain patterns harden. He has been practicing for several years now. He measures change not in a single transformative moment, but in the accumulation of small differences. More time spent reading a bedtime story with Sarah, more candid conversations in the OR, fewer moments when he walks out of a room and feels nothing. He does not pretend to be cured. He does, however, experience tenderness more often. A song on the radio unmakes him for a moment. He cries at a colleague's memorial in a way that feels like the return of a muscle. And yet, the horizon, April 12, 2040, remains real and present. He has learned to hold that date as a moral frame rather than a threat. It is a calendar knot he uses to tie habits together. If we scale practice now, the model says, the cascade probability drops. If we do not, systems may continue to function but hollow out meaning. He imagines that date not as a day of doom, but as a checkpoint for collective accountability. Where will we be? Will we have allowed functioning to outrun feeling? Or will we have made tenderness a practice that sustains life in its fullest sense? In the months that follow, the Reverser Network partners with a small publishing team to create a concise ebook, practical, portable, free, with the 7 practices, scripts for leaders, and stories from pilots. Donald writes the chapter on the 10-second pause and contributes many of the vignettes from the hospital. The ebook is designed to be a seed. It is not a manifesto. The team includes clinicians, educators, and a technologist who helps design a low-bandwidth version for communities with limited connectivity. They resist branding or celebrity, hoping the content will circulate because it is useful. When the ebook is released, it travels quietly. Downloads happen in pockets: a rural clinic, an aftercare group, a corporate HR director. Feedback trickles in. People report small but meaningful shifts. The Reverser Circle uses these testimonies to refine the playbook. They publish one clear caveat: these practices are experimental. They are no substitute for professional therapy when needed. They are behavioral experiments that may increase attention and connection. Through all this, Donald continues to show up in the ER, never abandoning his clinical duties. He learns to balance the invisible work of scaling practice with the visible work of patient care. He does not preach, he models. Sometimes he hands a nurse a scrap of paper with a script for inviting a team to a 10-second pause. Sometimes he sits with a grieving family and does nothing but be present for 30 minutes. Those moments of presence, though unspectacular, are the practices in their raw form. Near the end of another long night, the alien comes to him again, not to deliver another set of visions, but to note variation. Model update, the thought voice says. Local adoption increases. Replication observed. Sensitivity to sustained maintenance noted. Donald hears something close to a human sigh passing through the alien's telepathic cadence. Your species, it says, operates with both habit and choice. The model is not fate, it is contingent. The sentence settles in him like a cooling hand. He thinks of all the small acts that have accrued: the 10 seconds in hospital corridors, the phone-free lunches, the writing circles, the festival that felt like a public rehearsal in tenderness. He thinks of Sarah's blunt kindness and of the nurse who cried and then returned to work with a different gait. He thinks of the countless failures and the handful of mismatched victories. When the alien withdraws, the rooftop sky is starless, the city dim with pre-dawn light. Donald writes, in his notebook, a line that feels less sacred than practical: small acts, repeated, change systems. He adds a reminder: invite 15%. The figures do not eliminate ambiguity, but they act as a lever in the hands of people who prefer concrete anchors to vague, paralyzing dread. Years accumulate into habits. The reverser practices ripple into many neighborhoods. They do not become universal. They do not abolish suffering. They do not answer every wound. But they create places where people can try again, where tenderness is practiced before it is expected, where human presence is a habit rather than an exception. On a clear morning, the Reverser Network convenes a public day of practice that quietly marks the halfway point toward the alien's 15-year horizon. On that day, thousands of small circles convene: schools, clinics, workplaces, families, each with a modest instruction: 10 seconds, a no-device meal, 5 minutes of writing, or a story shared. People are asked to note whether the practice felt possible and whether it created a different texture in their interactions. The data collected is imperfect, self-report and anecdotal, but it reveals pockets of deep engagement. Social media has some commentary, some mocking, some curiosity. But the thing that matters is not the applause or the dismissal, it is the hundreds of individuals who, for the first time, teach a child to pause and breathe. Donald is there, essentially invisible in a crowd, teaching a small workshop in a community center about pragmatic fidelity, how to take the practices and make them resilient in contexts that are busy, overworked, or under-resourced. He sits across a table from a public school counselor and an exhausted corrections officer and a childcare provider, And he offers scripts, adaptive suggestions, and the same caution he has always carried: measure, adapt, and keep the practices accessible. That night, he goes home and finds Sarah in the kitchen, older in ways that feel both achingly quick and intimately familiar. They play a handclap game that has mutated from its original form. He finds himself watching her with an attentiveness he would have thought impossible 3 years prior. She laughs and tells him she used the 10 seconds at school to calm a friend who had a panic attack. He wants to say something monumental, but says instead, "Good. Keep it strange." She tilts her head, smiles, and the two of them take 10 seconds together. No devices, just breath and a shared presence. For Donald, that 10 seconds is not proof that the world has changed, it is proof that his life has. The alien's exact date, April 12, 2040, continues to be what it was when it was first placed in his mind: a projected marker, a horizon that structures urgency and invites action. It is neither proof nor prophecy. It is a modeled possibility that helps focus effort. Donald thinks of it as a calendar knot to check their work against. Where will we be on that day? Will we have been so busy maintaining systems that we forgot why they exist? Or will we have made tenderness a small, durable practice? On a rainless afternoon a few years later, before the 15-year horizon, but with enough distance to see patterns, Donald sits in a quiet room and reviews the aggregate of the reverser work. The data is mixed, uneven, and cluttered with human variables. Some pockets show encouraging signs of sustained practice, others reverted. There are places he cannot reach: overloaded systems, entrenched industries that monetize attention, policies that incentivize speed. Yet in other places, small cultural mutations hold. A hospital unit where 10 seconds are now ritual before handoff. A school where writing is taught as a kindness tool. A neighborhood where an hour of phone-free exchange has become a tradition at monthly markets. He understands the limits. These practices are not a panacea. They are not a replacement for justice or for broad social reform. They are, instead, a set of feasible acts that allow humans to practice paying attention to one another. They are a form of resistance to anesthetic habits. They are small, stubborn rehearsals of what it means to be a people who can feel. Where the world goes after April 12, 2040 remains open. The alien's projection stands as a modeled branch among many. Donald does not pretend knowledge of which branch will dominate. He prefers to work on leverage points he can influence: teaching, modeling, offering tools that are repeatable. His life is measured now in tens of seconds, in weekly techless hours, in nights when he writes messy notes and shares one with a colleague. His metrics are not fame or conversion, but fidelity and small cultural shifts. He knows the story could end in fear, or in what the alien called a function without flourish. He also knows it could continue into a future where tenderness re-enters habit, much as hand-washing re-entered practice after other public health crises. Not universal perfection, but a new baseline. He holds both as a clinician does, a differential diagnosis, an accounting of possibilities with the humility to act on the most plausible interventions. The final scene is not a cinematic apocalypse, nor a triumphant revelation. It is a simple morning, Donald and Sarah at their kitchen table, a radio murmuring in the background, a notebook open between them. She is older, her hair different, her questions sharper. He closes his phone. He takes 10 seconds. She takes 10 seconds. The pause is ordinary, measurable, and intimate. It is not a promise that the world will bend toward warmth, but it is a practice that preserves the possibility. If you feel the weight of the date and you want practical steps, the ebook with the 7 practices is available. Download it, try one small thing tonight. And if you want guided support, consultations are offered for organizations and small groups wanting to pilot these practices. One small daily choice, practiced by many, is the work we can do together. Share one tiny step you will try in the comments. And if you want to explore deeper, the guide and consultations are linked below.